Good morning, guys. Am I audible to all of you?
Yes, sir.
And my screen is also visible to all of you, right?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So only 4 people are there, which is not acceptable at all because my interest is going to be down if the number of people is less, right? So we'll discuss. So what exactly we can do? Any suggestion? Why
No,
people are not joining?
They're probably gonna just join like later on. Usually just come late.
Yeah, that's fine. But the thing is that before the before the session start, before 5 minutes, you guys should join. It's not like that. I joined the past, and then after 5 minutes, after 10 minutes, you guys are going to join. That's fine. If you are having some issue, you can join after 5 minutes or 10 minutes. That's fine. But that doesn't mean out of a 45 students, only 4 and 5 students are going to attend the class from the beginning. That should not be the case. Ideally, 10-15 people should be there from the beginning.
sir, I think we should start after 15 minutes.
Sorry?
After 15 minutes, we should start.
Then what is the then from 6:30 to 6:45? What I will do? I will wait for the students to join. That is what you are saying.
Maybe sometime it happened.
No, maybe sometimes in the sense what? I can see regularly maximum 12, 14 students are joining out of 45. I don't want to waste my 15 minutes for waiting for the student,
Okay, so as you please.
right? So if you guys are not interested for the live session, then what I can do is I will record the session and I will simply upload the session
No,
on
no, no, sir. The value of live session is very more important.
for live session. Live student is also important. For live session, student attending the classes is also important. It should not be like 5, 7, 10 people are attending the classes out of 45. Then other part is there. Instead of taking the sessions in detail, I will go through from the basic and complete the session as soon as possible. Right?
Yes, sir.
See, why I'm taking the sessions lengthy, why I'm explaining the concept in detail. It is only benefit to you, not me. Then you should attend the sessions regularly.
Yes, sir.
Nobody is going to explain the concept in detail, right? Because all other people are doing business. They are only, their main purpose is only to earn money. So they will complete the whole C# syllabus within 2-3 months. Right? So you are attending my classes means you have to attend the classes,
Yes, sir.
right? So if few people are attending, right, then my interest is going to be done. And once my interest is down, right, then that I cannot do anything special for you guys to attend the sessions. Okay. And what I'm thinking, instead of uploading the video, right, in the group, so the next batch, right, the next .NET Core batch, which is going to be taken by me, is going to be free. I'm not going to take any money from anyone from anywhere. they can attend my .NET Core batch, which is already I have announced in my group, right? So you guys can attend the classes without any fee. Even you can refer to your friend, right? And they can also attend the sessions without a single rupee,
Oh, thank you, sir. Appreciate that.
right?
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm not going to take a single rupee from anyone from anywhere, from any right? They can attend the session, right? That will be good because in this case, right? A few people are joining, 5, 10, 7, 15 people are joining, right? Which I don't like. In my classes means more number of students should be there. And if I make the sessions free, I think more people are going to join. But in that case, what will happen? You will not get the recorded session and documents. In that sense, you have to attend the class regularly. Is that clear?
Sir, please don't take any decision in a hurry.
Sorry?
Don't take any decision in hurry.
No, I'm not taking any decision in a hurry. I'm already made the decision from the new year, right? And I have already announced that the session is going to be free. Free means you have to attend the session. That's for sure,
Yes, sir.
right? No recorded sessions, no documents is going to be provided. Yes, what I can do is, right, going further, I'm not going to upload the video on the Telegram channel. I'm going to upload the video on my YouTube channel, and the document you can get from my website, right? That's fine.
Yep.
Yeah. Fine.
So in that way, more people are going to get benefit, and in that case, more number of guys are going to attend the session. Even what I'm thinking, I'm going to add other student also, right? Anyone, if you guys have any friends, they want to attend the C# session, right? Once this one completed, right? Once entity framework entity framework code first completed, right? Then I'm going to start link your design button and all those things. You can also refer to your friends, they can attend the session,
Okay, sir.
Oh, okay.
right? So basically what my thought process is, education should not be, the cost should not be a barrier for anyone to learn something, right? You can see my website, everything is free. I'm not taking a single rupee from anyone to learn anything from my website. And in the same way, the session are also going to be happen, right? So you just ask or you just tell your friends, they need to communicate, they need to contact me for the live session.
Uh, so just one question. Like I missed some part. Like, what about the videos? Is
Video.
there?
I'm as mentioned, the document link you will get from my website. Video is going to be uploaded on my YouTube channel. From YouTube channel, you can get the video, and from my website, you can get the document,
Okay, okay.
right? Okay. So, and this is once this code first approach is completed, anyone interested to learn LinQ design patterns, right, and auto mapper and all the remaining concepts, right, they can attend the sessions. Okay.
We are interested, Pranav.
Sorry.
We are interested. So link you concept and map also.
Yeah. So everything as mentioned in the course syllabus, everything is going to be covered, right? Automapper is going to be covered, LinQ is going to be covered, solid principle is going to be covered, right? File handling is going to be covered, and then then .NET framework architecture part is going to be covered, design patterns is going to be covered. Everything is going remaining. Those things are going to be covered, right? And once this .NET, C#.NET is completed, then immediately I will start .NET Core. In .NET Core, four things I'm going to cover: .NET Core basic part, entity framework core part, web API core web API part, and core MVC part.
Thank you so much.
right? And for that, I'm not going to take a single rupee from anyone, right? But what I can suggest, if you guys find something interesting, you can share the things with your friends, and whenever you get a chance, please help someone else. That is what my motto. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so database initialization in entity framework code first approach. So already we have discussed that based on our model classes and based on our context class, entity framework is going to generate the database for us, right? So if you look at the example what we have discussed yesterday, so you can see this is my standard entity, this is my student entity, and this is my context class, right? And in my context class, I'm using the base class constructor. I mean, in this case, the DbContext class constructor, which doesn't take any parameter. And here I'm registering two models, right? Two models. One is student model and another is standard model using the DB properties, right? And when this application is executed, right? When we run the application, based on this context class, and you see that there are two entities are registered, and here we are using the base class constructor. The entity framework API will create the database automatically for us. But now we need to understand, we need to discuss how the entity framework decide where we need to create the database, whether we need to create the database in SQL Server database or whether we need to create the database in local MS SQL DB. Right? What should be the database name? Where the database server is located? How the entity framework identify all these things? That is what we need to understand. And this is very, very important. And to simplify these things, I have created this picture, right? So look at this image. So once you understand this image, then you will understand how exactly the entity framework code first approach create the database. So the code first approach, entity framework code first approach, first check, right? What it will check? It will check the base class constructor. The entity framework code first approach will check the base class constructor. In base class constructor, each connection string passed to DbContext class constructor from context class. Do you pass the connection string to the DbContext class constructor from your context class? Yes or no? So whenever you are having some condition, so condition means either you passed or you are not passing. So either yes or no. So first it will check whether you pass the connection string to the base class constructor from your context class. If you pass the connection string, then what will happen? If you didn't pass the connection string, then what will happen? That is the first thing that we need to check, right? If the connection string is passed, right, what it means in this case, yes, the connection string is passed, then it will check each database exists at the specified location that what you mentioned in the connection string. Suppose you are passing one connection string. Connection string means what? What is the database server name? What is the database name? User ID, password, all these things you are passing as part of the connection string. Then you will check whether what database you mentioned, is that database available in the specified database? Yes, that is available. Then use that existing database. No, I'm passing the connection string. I'm mentioning the database name and I'm mentioning the database server. But in that particular database server, the database doesn't exist. I'm running the application for the first time. First time means database not exist. Then what you will do? You will create a new database for us, right? So first it will check the connection string, right? If the connection string is available, then this section code is going to be happen. So in this case, it will check whether the database exists at that specified database server. If the database exists, then it will use that existing database. If the database doesn't exist, then it will create a new database. Clear this part? I'll show you this thing practically. Whatever I'm explaining through diagram, I will show you this thing practically. This part is clear now?
Yes.
Right. So now let's say check the other things, right? So here he is saying, is the connection string passed to the context class constructor? No, the connection string is not passed. Then the left hand side things are going to be happen. So it will check each database name passed to the constructor, right? You are not passing the connection string. Are you passing the database name? Yes, I'm passing the database name. Then what he will do? He will create a local database with the same name in SQL Express, right? If you are not passing the connection string and if you are passing the database name, then in the local SQL Server Express database, you will create a database with the name what you passed to the DbContext class constructor. If you are not passing the database name, right, you are not passing the connection string. First of all, you are not passing the database name. If you are not passing the database name, then in the local SQL Express database, he will create a database that matches to the namespace and context class name. So in this case, what should be the namespace and what should be the context class name? By separating them with a dot operator, it will create a database in the local SQL Server Express. So from this diagram, so you can see in how many ways we can pass the parameter to the DbContext class constructor. So first, there is no parameter pass. So in this case, suppose you have not passed any parameter. So in this case, which section is going to be executed, the right hand side or the left hand side? Suppose I'm not passing anything in this example. So base class, so which section? Left hand side? In the left hand side, again the condition will be checked. In this case, the condition will be true or false?
False.
False. False means what? It will execute this one, right? So in this case, it will create the database in a specific database server in the local SQL Express database.
Yeah.
Where? Guys. So if I'm not passing anything currently in this example, where the database is going to be generated?
In our local.
In your local SQL Server Express DB, right? So you can see the database name is going to be your local DB, local MS SQL DB server, right? And inside this database, it is going to create the database. And what should be the name? If you are not passing the database name, then what should be the name?
And namespace dot the class.
Right. So this is the thing. Second option is that you can call the database by passing the database name, right? So in this case, okay, so we have already discussed this example, right? In our last session, right? If we are not passing anything, then it will create the database in the local SQL Server Express database, right? And in this case, the database name is going to be your namespace name dot your context class name. That is what I have already shown you right now. Calling DbContext class constructor by passing the database name, right? Now, what my intention is, I want to pass the database name, right? I don't want with that default name, which is provided by entity framework, that is the namespace name and the context class name. So instead of that, what my intention, I want to create the database with the name my context DB. And in this case, as you have specified only the database name, right? So it is going to generate the database in where it will generate first. Let us look at the diagram. So do you pass the connection string? Is this the connection string? No, this is not the connection string. This is the database name. So in this case, this part will be executed in this pass. Each database name passed to the DbContext class constructor from the context class. The condition is going to be true or false?
True.
True. True in the sense it will create the database in the local database and with the same name what you pass to the constructor. So in this case, it should create the context class. Sorry, it should create the database with the name my context DB in our local SQL Server database, right? So let us run the application and see. Application is running, right? Say in this case, it is going to generate a brand new database, and whenever it is generating a new database, right, at that time it will take some time, right? So we are getting the successful message Let's close this one, right? So now you just need to refresh this folder. So the database is created. Yes or no?
Yes, sir.
Right. So the point that you need to remember is, if you do not specify any database name, or if you do not specify the connection string name, by default it is going to use the local SQL Server database. If you only specify the database name, right, then only it is going to use the local SQL Server database. Right. Now the other constructor, right, the other constructor means where we need to specify the connection string, and in that case, right, it is going to generate the database in the specified database server. For example, right, I want to create the database in the SQL Server database instead of the local database. So I don't want to use local DB, right? Whatever the local SQL Server database provided by Visual Studio, I don't want to use that one. I want to use my SQL Server database, right, to create the database, right? SQL Server to create the database. For that purpose, what we need to use, we need to pass the connection string to this constructor, right? So we need to pass the connection string to this constructor. Then how we can specify the connection string? To specify the connection string, we have to use name equals to operator, right? So by using name equal, we need to specify the connection string, right? So let us see this, so let us understand this with an example, right? So again, there are two ways. No, again, there are two ways to specify the connection string, and there are, or you can say, there are two ways to create the database in the SQL Server database, right? What are the two ways? Let us understand, right? If the name of the connection string matches the name of your context class, either with or without namespace qualification, then it will be found by DbContext class when the parameterless constructor is used, right? What it means. Let us try to understand, right? So what it means, let me remove this one, right? So what, what this statement is saying, now, if you are having a connection string with the same name as the context class name, if you created one connection string either in the app.config file or web.config file with the same name as the context class name, even though you are going to use the zero argument constructor, in that case, it is not going to generate the database in the local SQL Server database. Instead, it will use the connection string what you specified in the configuration file. For example, let me add the connection string, right? Let me add the connection string, right? Currently, I'm going to my configuration section, right? Let me add the connection string, right? So here you can see I'm adding one connection string. What is the name of the connection string, guys? EF code first context. What is my context class name? EF code first context. Is the context class name and the connection string name same?
Yes.
Right. If the connection string name and if the context class name is same, even though if you use the zero argument constructor, in that case, the entity framework API will identify the connection string from the config file, and based on the connection string, it will create the database. So in this case, what connection string you specified? You specified this is my server, right? You specified the database name as EF fast context DB, and you specifying that you are using admin authentication, Windows authentication, right? So in that case, it will use this connection string, and it will fetch the connection string details, and you will create the database in the SQL Server, right? Now go to SQL Server, right? Please check now, verify. I do not have any database in my SQL Server, right? So, but in this case, I have specified the connection string, and in my context class, the context class name is same as the connection string what I specified in the connection string, right? Now if I run the application, then you will see that it is going to create the database in the SQL Server database or any database, right? What you specified. Why I'm getting this error? Config. Right, student added. Now you can verify the database. The database is created or not. In SQL Server, the database is created and you can find two tables, standard and student, as we have registered two model classes in our context. Clear this thing? Even if you want, you can also use the name equals, and you need to specify the connection string name, right? So you can also specify these things. Name equals, okay, let me do one thing. Okay, let me change the connection string in if code first context 2, right? And here I'm changing the database name if code first context 2, right? So with these changes, what you will do now? Now you can see the name of the connection string is same as the context class name, right?
Yes.
Yes or no?
Yes.
How? Here, what is the context class name? If code
DB
first
code.
context. What is the name I am
Default.
provided here?
Okay. Two.
2. So if the context class name and the connection string name is going to be vary, then it will not use that connection string. And in that case, it is going to generate the database in the local SQL Server team, right? But now it's not mandatory that the connection string name and your context class name is always going to be same, right? If both are different, right? If the connection string name and the context class name is different, and you still want to use the connection string, right? And you want to use that connection string to be used by the entity framework to create the database and to perform the CRUD operation, then in that case, you need to use the name equals operator. Name equals attribute, right? And here you need to use this EF code first context to. Here you need to specify the connection string name, right? So now you might be one question, sir, why you are specifying this name equal? Why not simply like this, right? If you are not using name equals, then it will consider this as the database name, right? If you are not using name equals, then it will consider this as the database name. And in that case, right, let me prove this thing. So database name, now if you run the application, right, then it will right, it will create a database in the local SQL server, right? Let me run this thing. It will not create the database in the SQL server database. Instead, it will create the database in our local SQL server. Right now, let me refresh the database, right? So it will create the database here. It's emerging, but I think this is working in this is strange thing. It should not be work, but it is working. That's fine. I think it is I think this is overtaken in Entity Framework 6. But previously, right? Previously, if the context class name, right, is different, then they are not working. But now it is working. That's fine thing, right? But when the name is different, right, you should specify. This is, I think, they have rectified this issue in the latest Entity Framework version, right? I have not checked with latest Entity Framework, but that's fine, right? So if the context class name it's same, then it is going to generate the database, right? So in this case, the name is same, and here I'm passing the same name. It is generating, but it is better to use this syntax. Clear? Earlier, if you are using earlier .NET Entity Framework, then it will not work, right? If you are using Entity Framework 5, then if you specify this F code first context 2, then it will not work, right? But if you specify this thing, then in Entity Framework 5 also, this is going to work and it is going to generate the database in the data. But in Entity Framework 6, this feature, I think they have made this available. So now it is also going to work, right? Clear, guys?
Yeah, clear.
Right. So these are the 4 different ways that you can use.
I have one question. So the placement of connection string is doesn't matter, or it's the matter in the
Sorry?
app update in app config file. The placement of connection string is a matter or not? So earlier we paste the connection string on the top of the startup element, right? But it was not working. But later we have pasted in the last, then it was working. Does it matter in the placement?
It should not matter, but I don't know why it is not working, right? Placement doesn't matter, right? Let me move this one to the top position. And let me give the database name as a 3. Give me guys 1 minute. Right. Let me put this as 3, right? So in this case, I have put the connection string here. Let me run the application. Right. So you can see the database is created. I don't know why it is throwing error at that time. Right now, you can see I'm getting these things. Clear?
Yes.
Yeah, but if I put the things above the config section, right, then it will throw some kind of error, I hope, I guess. Right now, I'm putting this above the config section. Right. So config section element allowed for config file, and if present must be first child of the root configuration element, right? So what it means, it is saying the config section, right, should be the first child of the configuration, right? So in this case, what mistake I have done? I have put this connection string above the config section, right? But if you are having one config section, then that should be the first child of your configuration, right? Clear?
Okay. Okay.
So if you are not putting that config section, then that's fine. If you are putting the config section, then that should be the first child of your configuration, right? After this child, you can put the connection string anywhere. You can put here, you can put here also, no issue.
Okay.
Clear, guys? So
Yeah.
basically you are having multiple options, right? If you are not specifying the connection string, then by default, it is going to use the local database. And if you are putting the connection string, and once you specify the connection string in the config file, right, there are 2 ways, right? So in this case, you can see code first context 2. Let me put this as a 4, right? 4, in this case, I'm putting this as 4. And in this case, so what I'm doing, I'm just removing the connection string. I'm just removing the name. So in this case, what will happen? Can anybody tell me where the database is going to be generated? Is it going to generate in our specified SQL server or in the local SQL server?
Is specified.
Why specified?
Local.
Yes, local, because in this case, the context class name is different
different.
than the connection string name. And we have not specified the connection string name here. So in this case, it is going to generate the database in the local SQL server. Right? So student 4, and you can view. Why it is not generating? Okay, so can anybody tell me why it is what happening in this case?
Already it is there.
Exactly. So already, so by default, what should be the name of your database? Can anybody tell me? If you are not specifying the database name and if you are not specifying the connection string name, then what will be the database name? Already told you, na? Namespace name,
Yeah.
not context class name. So this is the database.
It should be
Right.
a local database, sir. Should be local.
Right, already this database is there, and we have not done any kind of changes to the model classes, so it is going to use that existing database. Clear?
Yes.
Right. So these are the different ways, right? Once you have a look at this diagram, then you will get a clear picture, right? When and where the database is going to be generated and what should be the database name, right? So a database initialization strategy. Next, what we are going to discuss is database initialization strategy.
Pranav, quick question. If you want to drop the database, how we can do that?
That is what I'm going to discuss next.
Okay.
Right.
Sure.
So what are the different options and how you can drop and create the database, right? Many options are there. That is what the next thing we are going to discuss. So what is the next thing we are going to discuss is database initialization strategies, right? So when we run the application code for the first time using entity framework code first approach, then the database is created in the specified database server, right? In the specified database server, in the sense, if you specify the connection string, or if the connection string name is same as your context class name, then it will use that connection string and it will generate the database in the specified SQL Server database or any, if you are using Oracle or MySQL, no matter, right? But if you have not specified the connection string, and if your connection string name is not same as your context class name, right, then in that case, it will generate the database in your local SQL Server. That is what we have discussed so far. But what happens when we run the application code from the second time onward, right? We have generated the application code. We create the application. We run the application for the first time. Database is generated in the specified location. We run the application for the second time. We run the application for the third time. Then what will happen with the database? Will entity framework create a new database every time we run the application? What about the production environment? How do we manage, right? If you alter the database schema, right? How you manage the database schema? When you alter the domain classes, suppose you created one domain class, you have modified that domain class, then how you will manage those model changes in the database, right? So to handle all these scenarios, we need to use database initialization strategies. And there are 4 database initialization strategies. That is what we are going to discuss, right? So create a database if not exist. What it means, it is one of the database initialization strategies. And as the name suggests, create a database if not exist. What it means, now if the database not exist, then create the database. If the database is exist, then use the database. Clear, guys? If the database not exist, then create a new database in the specified server. If the database exists, then use that database, right? But in this case, right, if we update the model classes, right, first time we run the application, database is created, that is fine. Then we update the model, right? We have changes the model classes, and again we rerun the application. Then in that case, it is going to throw me some exception, right? So for better understanding, let me modify the context class as soon below, right? Let me remove this, right? What is my connection string name? My connection. Okay, my connection string, right? I'm providing the database name as my connection DB. Right? Is there any database my connection DB? No, there is no database with that name, right? So now see, I have one connection string with the name my connection string, which is going to create a database my connection string DB, and where the database is going to be created in my SQL Server Express, right? And if you come to the context class, so we are setting the database initializer as create a database if not exist. How you are going to set this thing, right? So you have to use the set initializer method. It's a static method which is available inside the database class, right? If you go to the definition, then you will see database is a class, and inside that class there is a method called set initializers, right? So using set initializer method of the database class, we are going to set the database initializer. How you are going to set the initializer? You need to create an instance of the specific database initializer, and to this and it's a generic class, so you have to specify the context class name, right? So in this case, so we are going to first, we are learning this create database not if not exist. So it's a class, right? So you have to create an instance of that class. See, new create database if not exist, and here what is the context class name? That is you need to specify it using this DbContext, right? So if you go to the definition of this, so you can see it is expecting one database initialized using the DbContext. So DbContext means your context class, and here the DbContext is nothing but your context class name. So you just need to create an instance of this. Now, if you go to the create a database initializer, then you can see the class name is like this. So we have already discussed in generic. Generic means this is nothing but your generic class. At runtime, you have to specify the type. And here you can see it is also using some conditional. And what condition? The condition is the DbContext must be a DbContext, right? In this case, DbContext must be inherited from DbContext. These things we have already discussed in our generic, right? So in this case, you have to specify a class. That class should be inherited from DbContext class. So in this case, I'm specifying one class, and that class is inherited from DbContext class or not? Guys,
Yes.
right? So here you can see this is my class, which is inherited from DbContext class. And this class, without using this angular bracket, you cannot create this the instance, because while creating the instance, you need to specify the type, right? And in this case, the type is going to be your context class. So in this way, we have set the database initializer as create a database if not exist, right? So in this case, what will happen when we run the application for the first time? It will check whether this database, what you specified in the connection string, is exist in that specified database server or not. If it exists, then use that database. If not exist, then create that database. So currently, you can see in the app config file, we have specified the database name as my connection string DB. And in our database, no such database exists, right? With the name my connection string DB, right? Now, if we run this application, right, then it will create the database with the name my connection string DB in our SQL Server database, right? Let me run the application. Application is running. Right, so as the database is going to be generated, so it is taking some time. And once you got this message, you can come to this part and you can refresh. My connection string DB is created or not?
Yes.
And what database initializer we have set here? Create a database if not exist. But what is the problem with this strategy? The problem with this strategy is if we update the model classes and rerun the application, then it will throw an exception. Let us do these things, right? Let us update the model classes. Right. So what I'm going to do, right? I'm just going to the student entity, right? I'm adding one model class. So here I'm adding this model class and here I'm commenting this one. So I'm updating the model. I'm commenting one property, I'm adding one property. That means the model is changed. And once the model is changed, right? So in this case, as the name says, create a database if not exist. If the database is not existing, then it is going to create the database. If the database is already exist, and again, if you change the model, then these things cannot be handled by the database initializer what we are using here. Right now, if we run the application, then you will get some exception. Right. So what exception? The model backing the EF code first context has changed since the database was created. Right. So what this invalid operation exception saying that the one so once the database is created, then you cannot change the model. Right. If you are changing, then please consider using code first migration to update the database. What is this code first migration? That we'll discuss later. But now the database initializer, what we are using, it will not handle the model changes. That is the thing that you need to remember. So this database initializer is going to create the database only if it is not exist. If it is exist, then it is going to use that database, right? But if once the database is created, once the database is exist, right? Then if you change the model classes, right, then it is not going to handle those changes. The schema is not going to be updated back into the database. Clear?
Yes.
Right. So this is one of the options. The second one is drop create database if model changes. Drop create database if model changes. What it means, as the name saying, if that see, first of all, you need to understand one thing. If the database exists, then use that database. If the database doesn't exist, then create a new database. But apart from that, the thing that you need to remember in this case, drop create database if model changes. What it means, now if the model changes, right, once the database is created, later if you modify the model class or model classes, then if you use this particular drop create database if model changes database initializer, then what he will do, once the model changes, he will drop the database and create the database again. Drop the database and create the database again. Then what is the problem with this approach? Can anybody tell me?
So we are feeding the data on the first time, the master data, so it will be get erased.
Exactly. So not only data, right? If your database is dropped, means what? Whatever data in the database, whatever. So suppose you created a database and later in your SQL server, you are creating some kind of a storage procedure, some views, some trigger, right? Some storage functions, many things you have created in the database. Then what will happen? Everything is going to be lost or not?
Yes.
Right. So this is the thing that you need to remember. Later I will show you how you can cheat the database data, how you can update the data without losing the existing data, how we can update the schema without dropping the database object. All those things we are going to discuss later. But for now, just remember, drop create a database if model changes. If you use this database initializer, then every time the model changes, it is going to drop the database and create the database again, right? Now what I'm going to do, I'm just commenting this one, right? And I'm just okay. So I'm just using this one, right? Currently, the database doesn't have the branch property, right? So you can see currently the student table is not having the branch property, right? So if you go to the column, then you will see branch is not there, right? Now what I'm going to do, I'm just going to run this application, right? So once I run the application, right? So it is going to drop the database because the model it changes and create the database again with the updated schema, right? Student added. Now if you see, now if you refresh this thing, then you will see that that particular property what we have added now should be available. So what is the name? Branch is available or not? Now again what I'm going to do, I'm just going to comment these things, right? Again I'm commenting, this means the model it changes. So once the model changes, right, now if I run the application, again it will drop the database and again it will create a new database with the updated schema. Right now if you update this student table, then you will see that branch property is not there. But the problem with this approach is that we are going to lose the data, and any database object which you created explicitly in the database, everything is going to be lost. Clear? Clear, guys? Later I will show you how you can manage those things, right? How you can update the schema without losing anything in the database. That is what we are going to discuss. So the next database initializer is drop create database always. Drop create database always. What it means? That it means every time you run the application, drop the database, create the database again. And this is only useful when you are developing the application, right? So for the development purpose, this thing is fine, but this should not be used in production or anywhere else, right? For example, while you are started developing the application, this thing is fine. You need to drop the database and create the database again and again, right? So drop create a database always. In this case, every time you run the application, it is going to drop the database and create the database. So can anybody tell me what is the difference between drop create a database if model changes and drop create a database always? What is the difference between these two approaches?
It will create the database every time, but that one, whenever we got the changes in the model, at the time only it will do the create and drop the database.
Exactly, absolutely right. This is the only difference between drop create a database if model changes and drop create database always. Always means every time you run the application, it will drop the database and it will generate the database. Now, if you run the application, right, then it will drop the database and create the database with the schema, right? Whether the model changes or not, that doesn't matter in this case. Every time it will drop the database and create the database. Clear, guys? And how to register a database initializer? For that purpose, you need to use set initializer method of a database class. Clear?
Yes, I'm having one question. So in which scenario we have to use the database.set initializer? Because we can't able to update the model, right? So if we update the model and we use the database.set initializer, it will throw an error. So but then which scenario we have to use this one?
The first one, right?
Yeah.
See, so suppose you have created the application, right? Now you are going to deploy the application in the production. So in that case, you need to use that database initializer, because once you deploy the application in the production environment, you don't want to drop the database anymore.
Yeah, but in the future, I want to update something in the model. At that case, we need, right?
No, see,
So need to have
in the
ads.
future, see, in the future, you want to update something in the model, then you have to do, see, there are two things. One is development, another one is deployment, right? In the development, you can use as I mentioned, in the development, you have to use these two options, right? Drop create a database always, and a drop create a database if model changes. But in the production, you can use this one, the first one, because in production means what? See, we are going to develop the application by using this approach, right? And once the application is developed, right, then I don't want to allow model changes in the case, right? So in that case, you can use that first one. But in that case, alone with this approach, it is not going to work, right? Because see, if you use create a database, if not exist any of these three approaches, right, then the changes you cannot handle, right? Along with this create a database, if not exist, we need to use some kind of a database migration technique, right? So that the model changes is not once the model is changes, right, it should handle the database perfectly. In that case, you need to use this one, right? So generally what will happen now, once you create the database, right, then whatever the database changes, again you need to deploy the database into the production environment, right?
Yes.
So see, what I'm saying, without understanding the database migration technique, right, you will not get a clear picture or clear idea about these three techniques, right? Because the thing is that if I'm using this one, then how the database is going to be handled. If I'm using other one, then how we can manage the database object or the data, right? So once we understand the database migration techniques, then you will get a picture, you will get a clear idea of what is the difference between all these three approaches, which approach I need to use at the production environment, and how I'm going to manage those things, right? Most of the time, you will go with the other one, that is drop create database if model changes. But not only, but along with this approach, right? Along with this approach, you cannot do all these things, right? You have to use other approaches also, like the database migration techniques. And if you are sure that the database is ready and I don't want to update the database in anymore, right? So once you run the application, once you develop the application, the database is created, right? So if you remember, the database is created, right? And you can take a backup of the database, and you can host and you can create a new database in the production by the backup which you have created from your local SQL server. Then in that case, you need to use this first approach, right? You know how to take a backup and how to create a new database from the backup.
No.
Sorry, you know how to suppose this is my database, right? And if you
Okay.
want to take a backup of this
Yeah,
database,
I know that. Yeah. From there, we go to the Gentex script. From there, oh,
right? So in that case, what will happen? In your local machine, you develop the application, the database is also created. Then what you need to do? You need to create create a database if not exist option, and host your application to the server. And from your backup, you need to create the database in the server. Clear? And in that case, any model changes will not be affect your database.
okay.
Right? Again, you will get a clear idea once you discuss those migration techniques.
Okay.
Right, so there are basically three options, right? We have discussed. One option will not allow you to update the model changes. One option will create a new database when the model it changes. Another option is that is going to create a new database every time you run the application. Right now, if any of the option, right? So now coming to your question, right? If none of the above options satisfy your requirement, then you can also go with the custom DB initializer, right? So if you use alone, if you use these options only, give me 1 minute, guys. Right? So if you use these three options, then you cannot manage the data, right? So suppose you want to manage the data, you want to set the data, then for that purpose, you need to use custom database initializer, right? Custom database initializer means you want to seed some data. So what is seed means you want to insert some data into the database, and if you want to keep the existing data into the database, right, when the model it changes, right, then in that case you need to use your custom DB initializer, right? Let us again this custom DB initializer real-time example we will discuss once you discuss the database migration techniques. But for now, I'm just going to show you how you can create your own custom DB initializer and how you can use that custom DB initializer in entity framework code first approach. So custom database initializer means you need to create a class, and that class should be inherited from any of the existing or any of the predefined database initializer class. You can create a class inheriting from drop create database always, or you can create a class inheriting from this drop create database if model changes. You can create a class inheriting from create database if not exist. And then once you create the custom database initializer by inheriting any of the existing database initializer, then you need to override the seed method. Right, the use of seed method, what is the use of seed method, how you can use the seed method, I'm not going to explain now. Later I will show you how exactly you can. Give me 1 minute. Right, so what is the exact use of seed method, I'm not going to discuss now. Later I will show you how you can use this seed method, how you can seed the data into the database, right? And the default implementation is not going to do anything, right? So let us create a class file with the name my custom DB initializer. I'm just going and adding one class file with the name my custom DB initializer, right? Using .cs class file, and then I'm just copy pasting this code. Right, I'm copy pasting, and here you can see I'm using create the database if not exist approach, and here I'm providing if code first context, right? In this case, this is the default initializer, and here I'm using the seed method. So what exactly what is the exact use of seed method? If you see, so if the database is not exist, it is going to create the database, right? And in your entity class, suppose you are having some master data, right? Without those data, you cannot perform any kind of operation. Let's say country master, city master. Then those country master and city master database table, you can fill with the actual data from this sheet method. So once the database is created, then automatically or by default, the entity framework is going to call this sheet method, right? So that is what we'll discuss in detail in our coming session. But for now, you just remember how to create your custom database initializer. You have to create a class inheriting from any of the existing class, if not exist, right? Or you can also use other overloaded other classes like create a database if model changes, right? Anyone you can use, and you have to override the seed method. What is the use of seed method means? Using the seed method, you can fill the data in the existing database table, right? So if you are having some country master, you want to fill the country master with some existing data. Without those data, you cannot perform the other activities. Then you can write the code here to fill the country master data using the seed method. And when you run the application, when the database is created, then once the database is created, before executing any of the code, by entity framework is going to call this method. Right now, we are using this my custom database initializer, and this is inherited from this class. So now you can go to this and you can simply use this custom database initializer, right? Now with the above changes in place, now run the application and it is going to work. The way create a database if not exist, in that way it is going to work. But in that case, after that, it is going to call the seed method. Clear, guys? Guys,
Yes.
right? And if you want to disable, and if you don't want to use any database initializer, right, then you can also disable that. How you are going to disable? You need to call the set initializer method, and here you just need to pass the null. Here we are setting the database initializer, right, any specific, and here we need to pass the value null. Once you pass the null, then it is going to set the database, it is going to disable the database initializer. Clear? Any question from anyone? Later I will show you how to use the seed method with real-time scenarios, how to use database migration techniques, right? So once the database is generated by the code first approach, if we modify some if we created some database object in the database server directly, right? And if our model classes, if our database, if our tables are holding some data, then how we can keep those data, how we can keep those database object, right, using code migration techniques, right? Those we are going to discuss in our coming session. But for now, I'm just explaining the different database initializer techniques. Clear? Any question from anyone?
No, sir.
Okay. Right. The next important thing, right? If you remember, we have discussed the code first default conventions, right? Default conventions means it will check for the ID or standard ID. So by default convention is that whatever the class name, right? It will create the database table with in its pluralized form, right? If the class or the entity name is student or standard, it is going to generate the database table with standards and students, right? We have discussed by default it will look for the ID or entity name plus ID property, and if it found, then it will create that property as a key property and will generate primary key, right? So in this case, you can student ID and a primary key is standard ID. So foreign key means what? Now for the foreign key concept, there is two end relationship. So in order to create a foreign key, there should be two end relationship. What is the two end relationship? Means foreign key means you want to establish the relationship between two entities. Then those two entities should have the navigation property, right? So if you take the example, in this case, the student class having this reference navigation property and student class is having this collection navigation property, right? And when the two entities having two navigation properties, then based on the type of the navigation property, it will establish the relationship. By default, here it is standard and here it is I collection. So it is going to generate one-to-many relationship, right? And that is what we have seen here. And the default name is standard underscore standard ID. You don't want that name. You want to create a unique name. That is what we are going to discuss. Null and not null. By default, based on the data type, right? Based on the data type, it is going to generate either the column type is going to be null or not null. Database order, right? In this case, what is the order means? By default, primary key is going to be the first column and the rest of the column are in the same order, right, as they have created in the entity class. You can see student ID and the rest of the column, right? And the property mapping, that is, and the relationship. That is what we have discussed. Relationship we have not discussed in detail in our coming session. We have only discussed the one-to-many relationship, but we have not discussed one-to-one and a many-to-many relationship. In our coming session, I will discuss those things in detail. So this is the default naming convention. Now, what is my requirement? I don't want to use standards. What is the default naming convention provided by entity framework? I don't prefer that. Instead of standard or instead of student, I want to create the database table as TBL standards, TBL students, standard info, student info. It means what? I just want to provide my own naming for the database table, right? For that, how we can do that, right? Primary key. I'm not going to create any column with the ID or standard ID. Rather than I'm going to create the database. I'm having a different name, right? Registration number is there, which is not having the default naming conventions like ID or standard ID. Registration number color property is there, and I want to make that property as the primary key. That is what we need to, how we are going to do. Right, so foreign key, I don't want to go with this standard underscore standard ID naming conventions, right? I want to create the foreign key column with my one specific name. How I can do this? How I can make the any of the property as null or not null? By default, string is not null, but I don't want. But I want to make this first name as not null. How I can do this? You can see decimal. This is going to be not null. How I can make this as a nullable column? Database order, right? You can see the order, first name, last name, all these are in the same sequence as this one, but I want to alter the name order of the first name is in the second position, then I want height, then I want weight, then I want date of birth. I just want to alter, I just want to provide my one order, right? How I can do this? Those things we are going to discuss next, right? So this is nothing but your configuring the domain classes, right? So configuring the domain classes. So we have already discussed the default entity framework code first conventions. The entity framework code first builds the conceptual model. So whenever I'm saying conceptual model, you have to consider the database only. So the entity framework create the database or generate the database from your domain classes using the default naming conventions, right? Currently also, you can see whatever the database, whatever the database table, whatever the column, whatever the relationship between the tables, right? Everything is generated by using the default conventions. The entity framework code first follows a programming pattern referred to as convention over configuration, right? It will configure based on the conventions, right? How, what is the convention means? The name should follow this pattern. If you are putting this thing, then that thing will be generated in the database. If you are putting ID or student ID, it will generate as the primary key, right? If you are putting the navigation properties, then it will make the foreign key relationship. If you are using a string type variable, then it will be generated as a null type column. And if you are using some primitive data type, it will generate the not null type column in the database. That means the configuration is based on the conventions, right? However, it is also possible to override these default conventions, right? Whatever the things entity framework follow, I don't want that. I want to create, I want to provide the table name by my own. I want to provide the primary key column as per my requirement. I don't want that default foreign key column name. I want to provide the foreign key column by my own. I want to provide, I want to create some indexes in the table. I don't want to map some of the property as a database column, right? So if you see, all the properties are created as one column in the database. And this is one property, right? I don't want this property to be created as a column in the database. How I can overcome this thing, right? This is possible by using, right? By using two approaches. One is data annotation attribute and another one is Fluent API. So the next important things what we are going to discuss is data annotation attribute followed by Fluent API, right? So basically, if you do not want the default conventions or default configuration which is followed by entity framework, rather than you want to follow your own configuration which should be followed by entity framework while generating the database, then we need to configure those conventions, right, in our model classes. We need to configure our model classes, or we need to configure our domain classes, and the entity framework will follow those configurations which we are explicitly configuring rather than the default configurations. Then in how many ways we can configure our model classes explicitly means in 2 ways. What are the ways? One is data annotation attribute, another one is Fluent API. And this is the backbone of entity framework code first approach. If you understand this data annotation attribute, and if you understand this Fluent API attribute, right, Fluent API and this data annotation attribute, then you can say that I learn entity framework code first approach. Until and unless, right, until and unless you do not understand this data annotation attribute, this Fluent API, then you cannot write, or you cannot develop application using entity framework code first approach. Let us try to understand. In this session, I'm just going to give you a brief introduction about these things, and from our next session, right, from tomorrow onwards, we are going to discuss these things in detail. So guys, remember data annotations means what? This is nothing but attribute-based configurations, right? Attribute-based configurations which can be applied to our domain classes and properties. How many guys? How many of you know ASP.NET MVC and ASP.NET Web API?
Yeah, you
Some.
know.
Right. So there
Yeah.
is something called attribute routing. You know.
Yeah.
So attribute routing means you need to decorate your controller or your action method with some attribute, right?
Yes.
That those attributes are nothing but your data annotation attribute, right? So data annotation means these are nothing but attribute-based configurations which you can apply to your domain classes and its properties. In MVC and Web API case, it is applicable to your controller class and action method. And in entity framework, the same attribute, right, we are going to apply to our classes and its properties. So don't think that this is a new concept which is available in the entity framework only. This concept also available to other the framework like MVC and Web API. And in .NET entity framework, right, whatever the data annotation attribute. So simply speaking, right, if you speak from the basic, right, basic means data annotation attributes, they are nothing but classes. They are nothing but simply .NET classes, right? And in this case, right, so in this case, to configure the entity framework model classes, right, they are I mean the .NET framework provide two namespaces. One is data annotation, and another one is data annotation dot schema, right? So data annotation and data annotation dot schema, right? So using these two different namespaces, we are having multiple classes, right? Or you can say multiple attribute. So whenever I'm saying attribute, you can consider it's a class, and that class I can decorate over another class or over some properties. How? That is what I'm going to discuss next, right? So I'm just going to give you a basic introduction. Later, I will show you the real-time example, right? Right. So in this case, you can see I'm using some attribute table. So in this case, you can use table or you can use table attribute. That is fine. And here you can see I have included the two namespaces, data annotation dot schema, right? So you can see in this case table and that attribute is faded. Faded means it is optional. Optional means if you use this attribute, it's fine. If you remove this attribute word, then it's fine. But if you go to the definition of this table, then you will see it's a class. And this class is inherited from the attribute class. And in .NET, in MVC and Web API, whatever the route attribute you decorate or any attribute you decorate, right? Then at that time, if you go to the definition, then you will also see that that is a class inherited from attribute class. Once a class is inherited from attribute class, then you can use that as an attribute. Attribute means using square bracket, you can specify that class. So in this case, using square bracket, I have specified student in. So in this case, what will happen? In this case, instead of generating student, it will generate the database name as table. Right? In the database, instead of creating a table with the name student, it is going to generate the name as student info. In this case, instead of what I can say student ID, I am going to generate the primary key column as a registration number, right? So that is what it is going to generate. First name, in the database, I want the maximum size of f name. Maximum length means, by default string is created with the size maximum in marker max. Right? But I want to create the length with 50. You have to use max length attribute. I want to create the by default, if you see, it is generated the data type as nvarchar, but I want to generate this as n text. So you have to specify type name, and by default the name is first name, and here you can see first name, but in this case I want the column name as f name. You have to use the f name. Guys, if you are confusing this table, key, column, max length, everything in detail, we are going to discuss one by one by taking some real time scenarios. But now this is just an introduction. I'm just giving you the introduction, right? The same way you can decorate the last name property. In date of birth, I'm by default it is going to use date time. Now I'm using the data type as date time 2 and the column name as DOP. Not mapped in the sense this property will not, for this property no database column is going to be created. Branch means, see, by default if you see the string data type, those are null type, right? So by default, so what I'm saying now, I'm making this as a required. Required means now this branch will become a not null column in the database. Registration number means here I'm using index means it will create a index on this column, right? So on this registration number, it is going to create a non-clustered index, non-clustered, non-unique index. Again, I will show you how to create a clustered index, how to create non-clustered index, how to create unique index, how to create non-unique index, right? Everything I'm going to discuss in detail. For now, just remember one index is going to be created. And here you can see by default it is creating the foreign key column as standard underscore standard ID. I don't want to prefer that. So here you can see I'm making this as standard ID. So this is the column name, and I want to make this column as the foreign key column. So in this case, you will not find the foreign key column as standard underscore standard ID. Rather, what name you specified here, standard ID. Is there any property? Yes, this property is available. So it will make this column as foreign key, right? And the table name is going to be this one, right? So let me do one thing. Use drop create database if model changes, and here I'm going to use this initialization, right? So drop create database if model changes. So now I have modified the student entity model, right? Now if you run the application, then you will see whatever the configuration we have provided using data annotation attribute, those are going to be take effect by entity framework rather than the default configuration, which, okay, entity validation error, some error is there. Right, so some we have make some properties mandatory now, so branch is mandatory. So this is the reason why it is throwing me this error. dbo.student.
So the column names are different for the first name and the last name, I think.
No, here you need to specify the property name as expected. Let me show the exception details. What is the inner exception? Invalid object name dbo.student info. Invalid object name student info.
Earlier we had the student as a table name. Now we have a student info, right?
No, student info is the table name, but in our case, it is going to be student entity. Okay, let me check this thing. My connection string. First name, registration number, first name, last name, age, branch, registration number, standard. That is fine. Okay, so let me drop this database. Student info table, standard IT. Let me run this. What is this login failed? Facing some SQL Server issues. Hmm. Cannot open database my connection string DB. My connection string DB cannot open database. Why the login failed? Config file, local database, integrated security. It is fine. Let me do one thing. Let's comment these things. Oh shit. I don't think it is going to resolve the issue. The statement conclude foreign key constraints. Okay, forget about this error. Now the database is created. Now you can see the database table and you can see the column. So there is some issue with the foreign key constraint that is expectable because we are inserting one standard and here we are specifying the standard ID and that standard ID doesn't exist in the standard table, right? This is the reason why I'm getting this foreign key constant issue. But the database is already created. Now you can see what is the database table number. You you guys understand why I'm getting that error, because I have using this set database set initializer. Again, I'm making that turn off. Right, this is the reason why I'm getting that error. So now you can see I'm using the student info. The table name is going to be student info. The primary key is nothing but your registration number, name, last name, DOP, date, time to branch. You can see now it is not null, right? And then you can see registration number, then you can see the standard ID column. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right, so now, so again, everything we are going to discuss in detail. Previously we have got the error because we have to make that database set initialization to off. We are using both the approaches. This is the reason why we are getting the issue. Right now we are getting some foreign key constant issue, and that is expectable because we do not have any any entry in the standard table. Right, and here we are entering some standard ID value as 0, which doesn't exist in the standard table. Right, clear?
Yes.
Right, so because if you remember here, this is the foreign key, right? If it is the foreign key, then it should have any it should have an existing data should exist in the primary key table. And what is the primary key? Standard, but we do not have any data in the primary key table. So this is the reason why we are getting this issue. Right, so again everything, right? Whatever the property at whatever the attribute you are seeing here, table key, column, right, max length, everything, what are the type parameter, what is this app name, what is this type name, what are the constructor of each attribute, everything we are going to discuss. So this is the approach. This is just an introduction, right? But the thing is that with data annotation attribute, it doesn't support all the configuration options that are required for entity framework code first approach. So everything is not possible. Some configuration you cannot do using this entity framework code first approach. What are the configuration we will discuss later, and in that case we need to go for Fluent API. With Fluent API, you can configure all the required configuration which is required for entity framework. But guys, remember, to understand Fluent API, right, you need to understand the one design pattern, that is Fluent API design pattern, or you can say Fluent interface design pattern. And anybody having any idea about this Fluent interface or Fluent interface design pattern? Anybody having any idea? Because this is required. Because if you do not understand what is Fluent interface design pattern, then it is very difficult for you to understand this Fluent API, right? So in fact, in our design pattern series, we are going to discuss this Fluent interface design pattern in detail, right? But for now, I'm just making you to understand what, how exactly the Fluent interface design pattern work. And whenever you are using Fluent interface design pattern, and some people are saying method chaining, both are related to each other. If you are saying Fluent interface means it's going to be method chain. Right, so we can say one is the concept, Fluent interface is the concept, and method chaining is the implementation of that concept, right? We will discuss this Fluent interface design pattern in detail in our design pattern series. But for now, I just make you understand what exactly the Fluent interface design pattern. Right? Suppose you are having one class, Fluent employee one class. In that class, if you are having 5 methods, then how you can access those methods? You have to create one object, and then you need to call the method object dot method name. Instead, and if you want to call 4 methods, then what you need to do? Object dot method 1, object dot method 2, object dot method 3, object dot method 4. Right? In that way, you will call those 4 methods. So what Fluent interface design pattern saying? So instead of using that object, right, to call the method every time, what you can do? You can use you can use the object only once and call the method in a chain manner, in a chaining manner. How? Now suppose this Fluent employee class having 4 methods. One of the method name is name of the employee, which is taking one string parameter. One method is born, which is taking some string, some data parameter. Working on another method, which is taking some string parameter. Stayers is another method, which is taking the string parameter, right? So in this case, in the case of a Fluent interface design pattern, so what you need to do, so you have to create an object only one, and using that object only once, using the dot operator, you can change the method one after another. You can see I'm calling the first method, then I'm using the dot operator calling the second method, using the dot operator I'm calling the third method, using the dot operator I'm calling the fourth method. So this is nothing but your Fluent interface design. No issue. You can use object dot name of the method. You can give a semicolon object dot one, you can give a semicolon object dot working, or you can give a semicolon object dot state, and you can give a semicolon. That is absolutely fine. But instead of using that object 4 times, what I can do, object dot one of the method name dot another method name dot another method name dot another method name. So this is nothing but Fluent interface design pattern, and this is, and we can implement this using method chaining concept. Right? What is method chaining? Method chaining is a common technique where each method, right, returns an object, right? See, I'm calling this method on one object, right? If you want to call a method, first of all, you need an instance of that class or not. Suppose this name of the method belongs to Fluent employee class, then I can only call this method on the instance of a Fluent employee. Can I call this method on the instance of a student class or instance of a product class? Is that possible? Guys?
No, sir.
No. So if I am going to call this, so suppose these 4 methods are available in Fluent employee class, means these 4 methods are going to be invoked only by using an instance of which class?
Fluent employee class.
So in this case, this obj is an instance of a Fluent employee class, yes or no?
Yes.
Then can I call this name of the employee method if this method belongs to this class?
Yes.
Then if I want to call this born method, then to call this born method, what you need? You need an instance of which class?
Fluent employee class.
That means the method chaining saying you have to implement the method in such a way that it is going to return an instance of that class. If the name of the employee method after implementation returning an instance of Fluent employee, then can I call this method by using the dot operator?
Yes.
If this born method is going to return an instance of a Fluent employee, then can I call this working on method using the dot operator? See, if this born method doesn't return an instance of a Fluent employee, then can you call this method working on? No, it's not possible, right? So method chaining is a common technique where each method returns an object, and all these methods can be chained together to form a single statement, right? Okay, so let me create a another application to understand this thing better. Even if you are not understanding, that is also fine. We are going to discuss this thing in detail in our coming session, right? So let me create one project. I have already created one project, right? So in this case, what is my requirement? I'm having one employee class, and I want to set the full name, date of birth, department, and address properties. But I don't want to create an instance of employee class, and I don't want to use these properties to set the values independently, right? So for that, what I can create, I create an interface for this employee, and that interface I have provided Fluent employee, right? And here you can see I have created an instance of employee class, and this is one of the method, that is name of the employee. This is taking one input parameter string, and I'm setting the name of the employee, full name of the employee, and returning this. This means the current instance, whichever instance invoking this method, that instance I'm returning from here. Born, again, this is taking the date of birth parameter, and I'm setting the employee class date of birth properties, and again returning this. So in this case, I'm setting this working on, and working on means I'm setting the department property of the employee and returning the this, and stay at means I'm setting the address property and return the this. So in this case, instead, see here I can use employee class and set these 4 properties, but this employee class is not given to us, right? What given to us is the fluent employee class, and in this fluent employee class, you can see we are having 4 methods. We just need to call those method, and here you can see I can call this method one by one. Even this is possible. Even you can also call this method separately, right? If you are not interested with this approach, right, still you can use this approach. This is also fine, but in this case, this will not form a single statement, rather it will create 4 different statements. This is absolutely fine. I don't want to go with this approach, because in this approach, this is not a single statement. This is 4 number of statement, and instead of this, I'm just using this fluent interface design pattern. But to work with fluent interface design pattern, method chaining is required. Method chaining means each method is going to implement, and then each method is going to return the instance, so that you can call the next method. Now suppose working on method, you can see I comment this thing. I comment this thing means, now does this method going to return anything? Now is this method going to return anything?
No.
No. If this method is not returning anything, then can I call this? Because it is not returning anything. If it is not returning anything, then how you can call this stays at, right? You can only call stays at method by using the instance of fluent employee. Yes or no? And in this case, everything you can see the return type of this method is fluent employee. The return type of this method is fluent employee, but the return type is void. Void means once this method execution is completed, it is not returning anything. So you cannot call the next method stays out. Now instead of void, if I'm writing string, then can I return this? Can I call the next method? Is it possible to call stage art by using this working on dot? No, this is also not possible, because working on is returning an integer. But to call this method, what is mandatory? What is required? It is should require an instance of a fluent employee, right? Now, if I change from string to fluent employee, if I comment this and if I write this, then you can see the error is gone. So this is nothing but your fluent interface design pattern, right? Again, we will discuss this thing in detail in our coming session. So fluent interface design pattern means by using the dot operator, you will call multiple methods to set the value of multiple properties. So in this case, you can see I'm creating an instance of a fluent employee. I'm calling different operators by using the dot operator to set the properties of this employee class. This is nothing but your fluent interface design part, right? Now, so for if you want to learn more about this fluent interface design pattern, right? Even we are going to discuss this thing in detail, right? But still, if you want, and I have already written one article on this fluent interface design pattern in my design pattern course, you can go and check these things, right? You can go and check these things right now. Now we understand how exactly the fluent interface design pattern work means. We need to create an instance only once, and by using the dot operator and method name, we need to call multiple methods one by one, so that it will form like a chain, right? Right. So we have already discussed that we are having 2 options to configure our model classes. One is data annotation, another one is fluent API. right? And if you remember, this is nothing but your Fluent API. And the next thing that what we are going to discuss is Fluent API. If you remember, guys, while we are discussing the code database first approach, the entity framework create one method called on model creating, right? And at that time, I have told you that this method I'm going to explain you while I'm discussing the code first approach. And this is nothing but, and at that time I have told you, this is nothing but your Fluent API. So now I'm going to show you how to use Fluent API to configure your model classes, right? So again, this is just an introduction. In our later article, in our later session, I'm going to discuss this thing in detail, right? So let me put this as student ID, right? Student ID, and I'm removing this as key. So whatever the property I have added, let me remove all these things. Right, I have removed everything, right? So you can see there is a property called the date of birth, right? So date of birth. So what I'm going to use, I'm going to use Fluent API to configure the date of birth property of our student entity. How I'm going to do. So first of all, you have to override the on model creating method. Using this on model creating method, you can configure your model classes using Fluent API. This on model creating method is basically is nothing but your Fluent API. And using this method, you can configure your model classes, right? So you can see here, you can see I'm using entity model builder. So you can see this method taking one object of model builder. Using this model builder, you need to first call the entity method. Entity in the sense you need to specify which entity you want to configure. I want to configure student entity, so you have to specify student. From this student entity, there might be many properties. Which property you want to configure? I want to configure the date of birth property using lambda expression. You can see. So once you period, you can see all the properties whatever available. So I want to configure the date of birth property. What configuration you want to provide? I want to provide the column name as DOP. I want to provide the column order as 3. I want to provide the column data type as data. Apart from these three, apart from these configurations, right, many things are there which we are going to discuss in detail in our upcoming sessions, right? So this is nothing but your Fluent API. So in this case, whatever the configuration required for entity framework, everything you can configure. But using data annotation, everything is not possible. But using Fluent API, everything is possible. In our upcoming sessions, we will discuss what are the things is possible using data annotation, is not possible using data annotation, and how we can make those things possible using Fluent API. Everything we are going to discuss in detail, right? So you can see here I'm calling multiple methods by using the dot operator means this is nothing but your method chaining, and method chaining means the implementation, and the concept is Fluent interface design pattern. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right. So again,
Sir,
I'm not.
one doubt.
Yes.
This method chaining or the one that on a single object we are doing this. So can we do this on each and every object of any class, or is it like restricted to some
See,
class?
See, it can be implemented. You cannot implement everywhere. See, for that, what I show you, you have to implement this thing, right? If you are having one class, if you are having multiple method, and if each method returning that instance, you understand instance means what? Right? The return
Yeah.
type of
So
all the
we
method.
need to implement class to do that.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, if this implementation is there, then you can implement that method chaining concept, right? That's why I've shown you. I have changed this return type. Then this is not going to be. Then once this method is called, then you cannot call any other method using that dot operator, because the return type is changed. So this is the reason why I have shown you how the fluent interface design pattern is implemented. Now the same thing is here. Same thing is here means if you go to the property, right, then the what is the return type? Date time property configuration, right? So in that case, and what is the column type? You can see this is date time property configurations, right? And if you go to the column order, right, what is the return type? Date time property configurations, right? That means what? This is possible because every property is going to return me the same instance, right?
Okay. So, and what are the advantages? Is it only the like writing, reducing the code, or is there any advantage?
See, advantages is that, see, if you are using model builder, right, and you cannot call this property directly using model builder, right? If you call this, suppose why I'm saying, suppose you make this as semicolon here, and you call this like this, right? Then how he can identify this property date of birth belongs to which model? It might be possible that this date of birth property is available in multiple entities, right? How you can identify that this data part property is belongs to student entity, or this column order what I'm specifying is for this data part property? How you can specify this?
Okay, so in order to do the like ordering of the properties or ordering of the columns,
No,
the data.
not for or not ordering of the properties, right? So see, whenever I'm configuring a particular property, many things I need to configure, right? First of all, I need to identify which entity. Then I need to identify for that entity or what attribute or what property. Then for that property, you can configure many things. You can configure the data type. You can configure the what should be the property name, whether it is required a property or not, what is the order of the column, right? Do you want to create any index on that particular property or not, right? Many things we need to configure, and for that purpose we should not go we cannot configure all these things separately. If we are going for separately, right, in this example I show you separately, right, that is possible in this case. But in this case, right, then in this case how he will identify that I'm providing this column name for this particular property? How you can specify the column order 3 for this data birth property if you separate everything?
Okay, so this is for the same field, but you are giving different
Exactly.
like attribute. Sorry.
Right? So in this case, the field is going to be in this case, it will be the same field, and for that particular field, I'm providing configuration. So basically, what it means we are configuring the model classes. Model class means this is the model class, and inside this model class, this is the property. And for this property, I'm providing this configurations.
Okay. Okay.
And to understand these things, I give you this example so that you can understand how it is possible to call this method by using the single model builder object. Clear, guys?
And this
Yeah.
entity property has column name. All these are the properties of that object class, is it so? Like in this API model.
So if you go to the API model, you can see properties, right? So properties of T, right? So in this case, it is not for that particular purpose, right? Many things. I'll show you this thing in detail. What is entity, right? If you go to the entity class, then you will see that this is the model builder and this is entity, right? And if you go to the property, right, then you will see that this is the structural type configuration, right? Configuration means it's a class. Right, so in this case tree structural type, and in this case tree structural type is nothing but your DB model builder, right? So in this case, so don't consider that everything is available within a single class. There is some relationships, right? And here you can see the structural type is a class. So in this case, what class we specified? We specified the, where is my context class? We specify the class is a DB model builder. So that is, and in that way, you can call this methods, right? If you go to the definition of this one, right, primitive property configurations, and it is going to return the instance of these things, right? So this is common entity and property, and for this, all these things, they are going to return the same date time property configuration. It is returning hash column time property configuration. See, the point that you need to remember is, don't think that everything is available within a single class, right? So suppose I'm creating one instance, right? Get instance, right? So here I'm having one method, public fluent employee get instance method, and inside that method I can return new fluent employee, right? So in that case, right, so in that case, you can create the instance. You do not need to create an instance of this class, right? So what you can do is fluent employee object, right, equals to, okay, let me public static get instance dot, right? So in that case, also this is going to be work, right? Don't think that every method is going to be available in the same class. As soon as, right, all the method return type is going to be same, you can call the next method. In this case, you can see the return type is fluent employee, so you can call this method. Clear? Here I'm returning new fluent employee. That is fine. So in this case, the return type is fluent employee. As the return type is fluent employee, so I can call this method right now. Now, if you want to understand another thing, I'm just making some changes, right? So fluent employee 2. I'm making this as a fluent employee 2. Fluent employee 2. Right, fluent employee 2, and here I'm giving working on 2 stage at 2, working on 2 and stage at 2. So what I'm going to do, I'm just giving this return type as this, and here I'm returning return new this thing, right? So fluent and stage at then working on 2. So after this thing stage at, right? So I can call this stage at 2, right? You can specify some value, then working on 2, you can also specify some value, right? So the point that you need to remember is, what is the return type of the method, and on that return type, the next method is going to be invoked, right? It's not be that all the method are belongs to the same class. As long as the return type is fine, and as long as the next method you can invoke on that return type, that is fine. Clear? Don't think that in this example, everything is going to be available inside this model bit. So in this case, it is going to return me something, right? What is the return type of this method property? So the return type of this method is a datetime property configuration, right? So datetime property configuration means you can, this method should belongs to datetime property configuration, right? So if you go to this, you can see the return, this method belongs to datetime property configuration. And again, the return type of this method is what? The datetime property configuration. Then the next method, what you are calling, it should have, it should belongs to that particular class, has a column order, right? So you can see this, right? So always you need to check the return type. And in this case, what is the this property class belongs to which class? Structural type configuration, right? And if you go to the entity class, then you will see this is the model builder, right? And this model builder having one property called entity. So you can call this entity. Clear?
Okay.
Right. So always try to remember the return type. Based on the return type, the next method is that method available in that return type class? Yes, available, then call that. Clear, guys? Any question from anyone? Guys? Okay.
No.
Okay. So from our next session, we are going to discuss the data annotation attribute in detail, right? So we'll discuss every data annotation attribute in detail with the examples. That's it for today. Let's meet tomorrow.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.